the forest core reactor. In October 1944, a Soviet reconnaissance unit was sent into a remote forested area near the Silesian border of occupied Poland. The mission followed repeated reports from villagers who described persistent ground vibrations and a low mechanical hum that appeared after sunset and continued through the night. These disturbances were not associated with artillery or troop movements. When the unit reached the location, they encountered an abandoned security perimeter marked by buried mines and collapsed watchposts, indicating that the site had once been protected with urgency. What lay beyond the perimeter did not resemble any known military installation. Beneath a thin layer of soil and roots stood a partially exposed steel dome. Despite months of abandonment and freezing weather, the metal surface was warm to the touch. The temperature did not fluctuate with wind or snowfall. After forcing entry through a sealed side hatch, the team discovered an underground chamber lined with lead panels and copper conduits. Pressure gauges remained fixed at stable readings. At the center of the room stood a cylindrical structure anchored into the bedrock. It emitted a steady vibration that could be felt through the floor. There were no insignia, no warning signs, and no documentation. The facility appeared intentionally stripped of identity while preserving functionality. A technical assessment recorded in a Soviet field report described abnormal radiation levels concentrated around the central cylinder. Samples collected from the chamber walls contained graphite residue and trace uranium isotopes. The layout did not resemble the documented German nuclear experiments conducted under the Uran-Varan program. There was no evidence of conventional reactor shielding or containment. Instead, the design appeared to allow heat and radiation to disperse outward into the surrounding soil. One damage gauge recovered from the site bore a handwritten label in German translating roughly to core throughput. No further explanation was provided. Within hours of the report reaching Moscow, the site was placed under immediate military restriction. All photographic evidence was confiscated. The reconnaissance unit was reassigned and prohibited from discussing the discovery. Follow-up expeditions were canceled without explanation. The forest was later designated a hazardous zone due to unexploded ordnance, effectively preventing civilian access. No official recovery or dismantling operation was ever acknowledged. Decades later, thermal satellite imagery taken during a civilian forestry survey detected a persistent heat anomaly at the same coordinates. Independent researchers who attempted to investigate were denied permits or reported being monitored during their inquiries. No public records confirmed the removal of the structure. If the forest core reactor was a mobile nuclear prototype or an experimental environmental weapon, it suggests that a parallel branch of wartime research existed beyond any program officially admitted by Nazi Germany or the Allied powers. The unresolved question is not whether the reactor existed, but why its purpose was never recorded and why its presence remains unacknowledged to this day. The Mind Restructuring Protocol. In January 1945, Allied forces advancing into Western Germany discovered an unmarked underground complex buried beneath the ruins of an administrative building outside the town of Kassel. The structure had been concealed behind a collapsed stairwell and sealed with reinforced concrete. When demolition engineers broke through, they expected storage chambers or bunkers. Instead, they entered a soundproof facility equipped with padded walls, low-frequency speakers, and what appeared to be medical restraint chairs arranged in a perfect circle. In the center of the room, a large mechanical device was suspended from the ceiling, surrounded by racks of glass vials labeled only with sequence codes. Initial assumptions suggested an abandoned psychiatric ward, but further inspection revealed inconsistencies. There were no patient records, no sanitation equipment, and no beds. The vials contained chemical compounds that modern analysis later identified as derivatives of scopolamine and mescaline, substances known for their impact on perception, memory, and emotional regulation. The device overhead was engineered to emit precisely timed pulses of sound and light, synchronized through a mechanical timer that ran independently of external power sources. Its intended purpose was not therapeutic. It was constructed to condition the human mind. According to fragments of documentation recovered from a burned-out file room adjacent to the chamber, the project was designated only as Protocol D16. The notes referenced repeated experiments involving sleep deprivation, suggestion cycles, and induced memory reprogramming. Several diagrams illustrated the placement of electrodes along the scalp and spine, connected directly to the central apparatus. Handwritten annotations suggested a specific goal: to remove undesirable behavioral responses and encode operational compliance within subjects. Some pages were missing entirely, others had been deliberately blackened by fire. No official mention of Protocol D16 exists in any surviving Nazi military records. However, a number of soldier transfer orders dated late 1944 list unexplained detainments under medical observation. The names correspond to units that later reported erratic battlefield behavior, including dissociation, lack of pain response, and absence of fear in combat. Testimonies from nearby villagers spoke of trucks arriving at night and muffled screams that continued until morning. One account described men who walked in handcuffed and emerged days later with vacant eyes and mechanical speech patterns. After the facility's discovery, the Allied Intelligence Division ordered its immediate closure. Scientific teams were allowed only brief access before the site was sealed. Reports were filed under restricted archives and never released. Subsequent aerial surveillance showed that the structure was later collapsed with explosives. No follow-up investigation was permitted. The surviving vials and documents were quietly relocated to a British medical facility and later disappeared from inventory altogether. If the mine restructuring protocol was truly operational in the final months of the war, it raises unsettling questions about how far military science had progressed in manipulating the psyche. The implications go beyond battlefield efficiency. They point to a method of reprogramming human thought at its core, and the possibility that such experiments may not have ended with the fall of the Reich. The quantum engine room. In April 1945, as Allied troops approached the outskirts of Leipzig, they seized control of a fortified communications bunker believed to be part of the German High Command's signal relay network. What they found inside defied every known category of wartime engineering. Beyond the expected radio equipment and message archives, hidden behind a vault-like door, was a narrow corridor leading to a circular chamber lit by low amber bulbs. In the center stood a machine, unlike anything seen before. It consisted of concentric metallic rings suspended within a gyroscopic framework, surrounded by rotating dials and mechanical counters. There were no electrical wires visible. The entire mechanism appeared to operate on pressure, gears, and magnetic induction. One British field engineer recorded that the machine spun without motive power and described a humming resonance that caused interference with all nearby radio units. A thick layer of dust suggested it had not been used recently, yet its components were fully intact and free of corrosion. Attempts to identify its function were inconclusive. It was not a weapon nor a transmitter, and it bore no similarity to Enigma or Lorenz cipher devices. However, among the scattered files found in a locked drawer was a schematic referencing Zeitform analysis, and a term scribbled multiple times in the margins. Vorhersagpunkt, loosely translated as prediction point. Two physicists from the United States, brought in after initial inspection, proposed an extraordinary theory. The machine appeared to model state-based outcomes not through linear computation, but through real-time adjustments of variable input based on magnetic field shifts. In simpler terms, it behaved like a rudimentary quantum computer, processing probability matrices mechanically rather than electronically. This was decades before quantum theory had matured in the civilian world. The implications were staggering, yet within 3 days of its discovery, the chamber was sealed, the machine dismantled, and all parts shipped in unmarked crates to an unknown location. The official report was labeled as experimental navigation device and promptly buried in classified archives. The field engineer who first logged the machine's existence was reassigned to the Pacific Theater and never spoke publicly about the discovery. He died in 1962, and his personal diary contained only one line about the Leipzig machine. "We opened the door to the future and slammed it shut in fear." In the 1990s, a historian compiling declassified Allied intelligence files found references to a device with a similar structure in a separate Soviet archive, seized from a Nazi research train destroyed near Krakow. Though the descriptions were vague, both machines shared the same naming convention and design proportions. Neither has been recovered. If the quantum engine room truly operated as a probabilistic modeling device, it suggests that wartime scientists were not just trying to win battles, they were attempting to predict them before they occurred. And if they succeeded, even briefly, it would mean that the race to control time itself may have begun far earlier than anyone ever imagined. The Black Channel Decoder. In late February 1945, a mobile Allied intelligence unit assigned to monitor enemy transmissions intercepted a bizarre signal while stationed near Calais, France. Unlike typical German military frequencies, which followed structured code formats such as Enigma encrypted Morse or voice transmissions, this one was erratic, looping, and emitted on a frequency band not used by any known army. The source location was triangulated to a bombed-out monastery situated along the coast, its interior largely destroyed, but with an intact basement vault hidden beneath the nave. Inside, the team discovered a compact steel container resting on a tripod, surrounded by audio recorders, signal interceptors, and wall-mounted oscilloscopes that were still operational, despite the lack of electrical supply. At the center of the chamber stood a device shaped like a radio receiver, but with no speakers, knobs, or tuning interface. It had only a single illuminated dial and an input for reel-to-reel magnetic tape. The device emitted a faint static pulse, followed by occasional sequences of tones that lasted exactly 47 seconds each. These tones did not match any known pattern, language, or mathematical progression. The team captured 3 full loops before the signal abruptly ceased. Their report described the transmission as auditory information beyond categorization. Initial analysis failed to detect the modulation or encryption. The tones resisted conversion into data or symbols. They simply existed, looping, repeating, and then vanishing. The discovery was marked as classified experimental broadcast technology and labeled under a code name Project Echo 7. However, what unsettled the team was not just the message, but the logs they found nearby. The handwritten notes, in English, not German, described prior attempts to isolate the signal's source. Each entry ended with the same sentence: not originating from ground-based transmission. One line, underlined repeatedly in red ink, read, "Signal persists regardless of atmospheric disruption." The implication was chilling. The source was not local, nor terrestrial, and yet it was being studied in a Nazi-occupied facility, with no explanation as to how it had been captured. Upon returning to headquarters, the intelligence team's recording equipment was seized. The device itself vanished from records. Internal memos indicate that the monastery was later demolished, and the foundation flooded as part of a post-war reconstruction initiative. No further references to Project Echo 7 appear in Allied archives. In 1977, a declassified Soviet intelligence file mentioned a parallel incident involving a signal of unknown origin intercepted from the North Atlantic in 1944. The waveform pattern was nearly identical to the one recorded in France, yet no collaboration between the two nations was ever acknowledged. Both signals shared a unique auditory signature, a rising pulse that ended with what could only be described as a synthetic breath. To this day, no explanation has surfaced. Some speculate it was a failed Nazi attempt to fabricate alien transmissions as psychological warfare. Others believe it was a genuine anomaly, an echo from a source beyond the Earth, or even beyond time itself. Whatever its origin, the Black Channel Decoder was one of the few devices that didn't seek to transmit, but to listen. And what it heard was never meant to be played back: the underground memory vault. In March 1945, as Allied forces advanced into the Austrian Alps, a reconnaissance unit exploring the abandoned railway tunnels near the town of Eisenerz stumbled upon a sealed passage obscured behind a false wall. The entrance led to a deep shaft, reinforced with riveted steel beams and layers of heat-treated concrete. Descending over 200 meters beneath the mountain, the soldiers entered a complex of narrow corridors carved with surgical precision, leading to a chamber lined with dozens of identical vaults embedded into the walls. Each vault was marked not by number or name, but by a single engraved symbol resembling intersecting spirals. Inside the first opened vault, they found a set of cylindrical cartridges encased in protective sleeves. Each cartridge contained long strands of what appeared to be magnetic tape, although the material was not consistent with any Allied recording medium of the time. Attempts to play the tapes on standard equipment failed. The magnetic signature was irregular and did not conform to known encoding formats. Further down the corridor, several of the other vaults had been rigged with pressure-triggered destruction mechanisms, suggesting that the data within them was never meant to be retrieved casually. The design was meticulous. It implied that the entire structure was not for storage, but for long-term isolation. A partial blueprint retrieved from a nearby control station referenced the project under a vague title, Information Speicherlinie, or Information Storage Line. The document outlined a network of underground tunnels running between southern Germany and northern Austria with a total of 18 vault sites connected by reinforced rail transport. One section described rotating memory caches that could be moved between sites on demand. The vaults were climate-controlled and lined with materials designed to resist corrosion, fire, and electromagnetic pulses. Whatever was stored here had been deemed critical enough to survive not just the war, but any potential collapse of infrastructure. What made the discovery even more unsettling was the absence of any traditional military oversight. There were no signs of SS administration, no personnel rosters, no command hierarchy. Instead, the only documents found referred to a non-military entity simply named AG Group of Five, with no affiliation to the Nazi government or Wehrmacht. Intelligence analysts later speculated that this may have been a shell organization created to bypass standard chain of command and obscure the nature of the vaults from both enemy and ally alike. Following the war, the entire tunnel complex was sealed under the directive of the Allied Control Council. Access was officially restricted due to structural instability, but aerial surveys showed no evidence of degradation. In the early 1960s, Austrian engineers attempting to reopen nearby railway tunnels reported that their equipment repeatedly failed when approaching the old shaft. Compasses spun erratically. Communication systems dropped. No excavation was permitted. To this day, the full extent of the underground memory vault remains unknown. What data was deemed too dangerous or valuable to leave above ground? Was it scientific, psychological, strategic, or something else entirely? The design suggests planning beyond the scope of a desperate regime in its final days. It implies intent, continuity, and the possibility that some knowledge was never meant for public history, only for those prepared to wait in silence until the right time arrived. The Dream Control Operation. In February 1945, Allied aerial reconnaissance identified a remote facility nestled within the snow-covered ridges of northern Norway. Though it had no strategic value on military maps, the site emitted unusually high heat signatures and electromagnetic pulses, prompting fears of hidden radio operations or radar installations. A joint British-Norwegian team was dispatched, expecting to find a communications hub. What they encountered was something else entirely. Beneath a camouflage net and snow barriers stood a squat concrete structure with narrow slits for windows, reinforced doors, and internal walls padded with soundproofing material. Inside, a series of identical rooms were arranged like laboratories, each containing a single reclining chair, a cranial harness, and audio emitters mounted above the headrest. The rooms were spotless, no signs of violence, but unmistakably clinical. On the walls hung charts mapping human sleep cycles, neural activity patterns, and what appeared to be forced induction techniques. Journals found in the control room, written in German but annotated in French, referenced a protocol named Traumschleuse, literally dream gate. Each subject underwent a regimented process involving auditory immersion, chemical sedation, and synchronized light pulses. The intention was not merely to induce sleep, but to override it. According to the recovered notes, the experiment sought to insert programmable commands directly into the subconscious, forming a kind of behavioral software written into the architecture of the dreaming mind. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a wall-mounted reel containing hours of pre-recorded dream sequences, not stories, but directives. Voice recordings in multiple languages issued instructions related to movement, target recognition, and emotion suppression. One recurring phrase appeared across transcripts: "You are no longer who you were." The implication was horrifying. These were not dreams, but mental reprogramming sessions delivered under the cover of sleep. The protocol even included fail-safes, keywords that would supposedly erase the implanted material if spoken by a handler. This suggested not only experimentation, but active deployment. Eyewitness testimony came later from a Norwegian nurse who had been forced to work at the site during the occupation. She reported that a dozen soldiers were brought in over a period of 3 weeks, all young, all unresponsive to external stimuli once treatment began. When released, they exhibited strange behavior, prolonged silences, difficulty recognizing former comrades, and in some cases, bursts of emotion entirely detached from context. Several went missing shortly after. One was reported to have walked into the Arctic Sea and never returned. After the liberation of Norway, the facility was quietly demolished by British forces. All remaining equipment was transported out under diplomatic seal. None of it appeared in post-war recovery inventories. No documentation was submitted to the Nuremberg trials. The official stance was that the site had been used for weather observation and was structurally unsound. Photographic evidence of the chair apparatuses was lost in a fire at a military records depot in 1947. The only surviving artifact is a sliver of magnetic tape held in a private collection, containing a 4-minute loop of rhythmic tones and a calm voice repeating the phrase, "Forget the pain, I remember the mission." If the Dream Control operation achieved even partial success, it would mean that wartime powers may have crossed a boundary few dared to admit even existed, the line between influencing a man's thoughts and writing them entirely from scratch. In the silence of sleep, a new kind of warfare may have already begun. The Arctic Code Base. In May 1945, a British expedition team scouting glacial collapse zones in eastern Greenland encountered a partially exposed metallic structure protruding from the ice near Scoresby Sound. The object was rectangular, embedded at an angle, and surrounded by fragmented crates marked with faded German military insignias. Initial assessment suggested a downed transport container, but as they cleared the ice, it became clear that the site was not a crash. It was a foundation, the upper corner of an underground facility deliberately constructed beneath the glacial sheet. An entrance shaft was discovered 40 meters away, covered by snow but intact. Upon entry, the team found a narrow descending staircase leading to what would later be termed the Arctic Code Base. The structure extended deeper than expected, reinforced with anti-corrosive metal plating and powered by a residual energy source still active upon discovery. Along the walls of the main corridor were panels covered in symbols and glyphs that did not correspond to any known German cipher system. The writing had angular patterns and rhythmic spacing, more akin to archaic alphabets than military code. Technicians attempting to translate the symbols initially believed them to be modified Nordic runes, but linguists brought in from Denmark quickly dismissed that theory. The characters did not match any historical language, nor any encryption style used by any army involved in the war. Inside the central chamber was a large table-sized console, flat and cold to the touch, with grooves shaped precisely to hold thin metallic plates that had been scattered across the floor. Each plate contained more symbols etched in micro-relief, their arrangement too precise to be decorative. The plates were resistant to acid, heat, and electromagnetic scanning, rendering them unreadable through conventional methods. Analysis revealed the material was a rare magnesium alloy with trace elements of yttrium and scandium, a combination not typically used in weapons or aircraft. It suggested an entirely different purpose. The only document found in the entire base was a brief field note written by hand and tucked into a toolkit near the airlock. It stated, without signature, "Found beneath glacier, not ours. Do not attempt to replicate. Copy only." The note was dated February 1943, 2 years before the team's discovery, implying that German forces had not built the structure, but had uncovered it and attempted to study it in secret. The absence of technical annotations, coupled with the layers of preservation and cold-resistant engineering, pointed toward a site not designed for wartime use but for long-term concealment. Following the report, the British military sealed the facility and declared the surrounding region off-limits for scientific access. The expedition team was reassigned and instructed never to speak of the operation. When a Danish geological survey attempted to revisit the area in 1963, they were intercepted by NATO forces and turned away under the justification of climate instability and glacial hazard. No further official expeditions have been recorded. To this day, no one knows who constructed the Arctic Code Base, or why. The implications are deeply unsettling. If the structure was truly uncovered by the Germans and predates their occupation, then it represents not just a wartime mystery, but a challenge to our understanding of history itself. Its language remains unreadable, its origin unclaimed, its purpose unknown. Yet the symbols carved into those cold plates remain, waiting for someone, somewhere, who already knows how to read them. The Blood Echoes program. In April 1945, as Nazi Germany crumbled under the weight of advancing Allied forces, a convoy of trucks was spotted, leaving a secluded mountain laboratory near Innsbruck, Austria. Surveillance reports showed that the vehicles were carrying biological containment units and medical equipment typically reserved for field hospitals. However, no wounded soldiers were ever accounted for in that area. The convoy disappeared into the Tyrolean Alps, and no further record of its destination was found. Weeks later, Allied troops discovered the facility it had departed from, hidden behind an avalanche-triggered rock wall. What they uncovered inside ignited one of the most disturbing theories of wartime experimentation ever proposed. The site had been stripped almost entirely. Equipment racks were empty, logs removed, samples destroyed. But a single refrigerated chamber remained sealed, overlooked by the evacuation. Inside were 10 labeled vials of synthetic serum, each marked with a different 4-digit code and a cryptic emblem, a stylized double helix enclosed in a black triangle. Nearby, a journal bound in pigskin leather detailed a project referred to only as Blutico, Maiko, or Blood Echo. Its stated objective was the transmission of memory and behavior through the bloodstream. The theory proposed by the project's anonymous authors centered around the idea that traumatic experiences leave biological imprints, not just psychological scars, but cellular echoes embedded in the blood. These imprints, they believed, could be extracted, preserved, and transferred into another host, effectively injecting select experiences into the recipient's psyche. The subjects of these transfusions were reportedly Allied prisoners of war and political detainees. Once injected, soldiers from the Waffen-SS Special Detachment were observed undergoing radical changes in behavior, including the sudden acquisition of foreign languages, unfamiliar tactical instincts, and, most alarmingly, uncontrollable bursts of aggression tied to memories they should not have possessed. The journal described one case in which a soldier, upon receiving a full injection, began speaking fluent Czech and recalled in detail a resistance raid in Prague that had occurred months earlier. He had never left Germany. Another account told of a recipient who repeatedly dreamt of confinement in a Soviet labor camp, despite never being captured. The nightmares became so intense that he attempted to claw out his own eyes, screaming in Russian about barbed wire and frostbite. There were no indications that the experiences were suggested to him in any way. When Allied intelligence reviewed the documents, they concluded that the project had possibly succeeded in encoding trauma into biological form. A senior analyst at the time wrote, "What we have found here is not medicine, it is memory without consent." Within days, the surviving serum was transported under armed escort to an undisclosed location in Britain. The facility was destroyed by controlled demolition, and its coordinates erased from military maps. No mention of the Blood Echoes program appeared in the Nuremberg trials or post-war publications. All personnel associated with the laboratory were either untraceable or listed as casualties in the final weeks of the war. Decades later, a journalist investigating wartime psychological experiments uncovered a patent filed in 1953 by a private firm in West Germany describing behavioral transference via blood medium. The applicant was a former SS biochemist under an assumed name. If the Blood Echoes program was real, it suggests that memory, the most intimate sacred element of human identity, may not be confined to the brain alone. The possibility that a life's worth of suffering could be bottled, stored, and forcibly injected into another person is not just a violation of ethics. It is a form of psychological possession that bypasses the mind and speaks directly to the blood. The Silent Cathedral. In March 1945, French resistance fighters operating in the countryside near Le Mans reported a strange series of incidents surrounding a 12th century cathedral that had been repurposed by German forces during their retreat. The building had been sealed from public access for nearly a year, guarded at all hours despite its lack of strategic value. Locals claimed they heard no sounds from inside, no footsteps, no voices, not even echoes. Birds refused to nest in the nearby trees. One resistance member who approached the cathedral reported an overwhelming sense of pressure in his ears, as if he had descended deep underwater. Within days, Allied units moved in to retake the area, and what they discovered inside the church would never appear in any official report. The nave had been completely emptied. In its place stood a symmetrical arrangement of metallic rods, suspended from the ceiling like inverted tuning forks. Each was connected to a series of emitters lining the base of the columns, and in the center of the altar, a hemispherical dome had been installed, encased in soundproofing foam and covered in black cloth. Inside that dome was a single chair, bolted to the floor, and an array of devices designed to deliver targeted frequencies at extremely high or low decibel levels. No documentation explained its construction. No engineers were found. Yet the equipment was active, humming at barely audible levels, and every recording device brought in by the troops malfunctioned within minutes. What unsettled the investigators most was the unnatural silence. Microphones picked up no environmental noise. Voice recordings captured only static. Tests performed later showed that the entire cathedral had been tuned, not acoustically, but psychologically. Allied scientists hypothesized that the array had been designed to emit infrasound and ultrasonic frequencies capable of disrupting emotional and cognitive functions. At the exact resonant frequency of human fear, even without sound being consciously heard, the brain reacts. Victims report hallucinations, nausea, and overwhelming despair. One journal left behind in a German officer's case described the building as an echo chamber for the soul, stating that after 5 minutes inside the chamber, soldiers were unable to recall their own names. It mentioned a phrase that appeared more than once: clean the mind, leave the shape. There were also references to testing civilian samples, but no records of who those civilians were or where they had gone. After the war, the cathedral was placed under immediate military jurisdiction. Restoration was denied. Locals were told the structure had suffered foundational instability and would be demolished. Instead, the building remained sealed for nearly a decade, during which it was patrolled by rotating security teams. In 1956, it was quietly reopened to the public, with no trace of the devices remaining. But visitors continued to report dizziness, disorientation, and a disturbing silence within its walls. One tourist in 1973 collapsed during a service, claiming he could hear the ground breathing. The Silent Cathedral remains a holy site by appearance only. If the structure was indeed repurposed into a psychological weapon, it represents a terrifying convergence of science, faith, and mind control. Unlike a bomb, it does not destroy the body. It breaks the inner voice, that last refuge of identity, and replaces it with something quieter, something waiting to be filled. The Omega Directive. In the final days of the war, as Berlin collapsed under constant bombardment, a sealed vault was discovered beneath the charred remains of the Reich Chancellery. It was located 2 levels below the primary command center, behind a blast door that required both biometric and mechanical overrides, a level of security not observed in any other part of the complex. Inside, Allied intelligence officers found a single steel briefcase resting on a raised plinth, surrounded by a ring of collapsed equipment racks and an empty safe that had been forcibly opened. The briefcase bore no markings except for one deeply engraved character on its surface, the Greek letter Omega. When opened, it contained a single document, a long sheet of encrypted text printed on metallic foil, completely resistant to fire and moisture. There were no signatures, no letterheads, and no accompanying cipher key. At the top of the page, in bold black ink, was the phrase Zur letzten Ordnung, translated as "for the final directive." The only part of the text written in plain language appeared at the bottom of the page, reading simply, "Execute only if containment fails." No record existed of who was authorized to execute it, or what precisely needed to be contained. The document was immediately sent to a secure British decryption facility, where experts from the former Bletchley Park team attempted to analyze it. The structure of the text defied all known German military ciphers. It did not match Enigma, Lorenz, or any Allied cryptographic schema. Mathematical analysis revealed that the character frequency did not follow expected linguistic patterns. One analyst remarked that the structure looked less like a message and more like an instruction set, perhaps for a machine that had not yet been built. Compounding the mystery was a memo recovered from a nearby incinerator chute, partially burned but legible. It referenced an initiative codenamed Eclipse, detailing an emergency deployment schedule for a device known only as the Temporal Containment Array. No technical specifications were attached. The memo warned of irreversible destabilization fields and included the chilling line. Once initiated, the reversal protocol is no longer valid. Chronoperimeter must remain sealed. These words prompted alarm among the analysts. The idea that the Nazis had been researching temporal containment, time-based isolation, or manipulation had always been relegated to fringe speculation. Yet, here was a document that, if authentic, hinted at technologies so advanced and dangerous that even in the face of total defeat, it was deemed necessary to destroy any record of them. And yet, the Omega Directive survived. To this day, the foil document remains undeciphered. It resides in a sealed vault within a private defense archive in the United Kingdom. Access has been denied to all civilian researchers. The British Ministry of Defense officially classifies the document as non-operational intelligence debris. However, an internal file released by a whistleblower in 1998 described the Omega Directive as an unresolved existential contingency with unknown consequences if activated. If this directive truly contains the final failsafe of a dying regime, it raises one terrifying possibility: that somewhere within the chaos of collapse, the Third Reich left behind not a weapon, but a mechanism, not a message to the future, but a trigger buried in time, waiting for the precise moment someone foolishly tries to read it. Conclusion: these 10 operations, scattered across ruins, frozen beneath glaciers, buried in bunkers and cathedrals, do not represent isolated moments of wartime madness. They form a chilling mosaic, a shadow framework of experimentation and control that cuts across borders, ideologies, and even disciplines. This is not a story about the madness of war. It is a record of ambition that dared to touch the very structure of reality, and then was silenced. Again and again, the same pattern emerges: discovery, experimentation, sudden silence. Whether it was a reactor radiating warmth long after its creators vanished, a machine that might have whispered the future, or frequencies that erased identity through soundless terror, each project reached a threshold and then disappeared under orders marked classified, lost in demolition reports, or written off as myth. It is too consistent to be coincidence. There was a method behind the vanishing, a mechanism of erasure working in tandem with power. The suppression was not random. It was organized. Every facility was sealed. Every file was redacted. Every surviving witness was either relocated, reassigned, or erased from public memory. Allied forces, Axis researchers, and post-war intelligence agencies played their roles. Scientific institutions that should have investigated these anomalies instead buried them deeper. Some of the technologies could have redefined energy, human cognition, or time itself. Yet none were ever pursued openly. The cost of revealing them was not measured in money or ethics. It was measured in control, and with that control came silence. Not just the silence of sealed cathedrals or scrambled transmissions, but the kind that stretches across decades, the kind that ensures what was once discovered cannot be rediscovered. A vault without a key, a signal without a source, a wound in history that was stitched shut before it could be understood. What we lost may never be recovered. Machines that bent probability, serum that transferred memory, frequencies that could program identity. These were not just wartime fantasies. They were tangible, engineered, and terrifyingly real. And they were destroyed not because they failed, but perhaps because they worked, perhaps because they dared to cross a line civilization was not ready to see. But the threat remains, because silence does not mean safety. Somewhere, these ideas still exist, in vaults not yet opened, in labs repurposed under new names, in theories dismissed too quickly. The experiments may have ended, but the knowledge never truly dies.